Missions. A middle-aged Hispanic female banker gave an elderly African-American woman 30 days to lose everything.
The banker didn't even look up when I walked in. He was reading something on his desk, and he made me stand there for a full 30 seconds before he gestured at the chair across from him like he was doing me a favor. I was 19 years old. I had driven 40 minutes in a truck with a cracked defroster on a Thursday morning in February, wearing my grandfather's barn coat, because my own coat wasn't warm enough for Wisconsin in winter. The coat still smelled like him diesel and hay, and something I couldn't name that was just him. My grandfather had been dead 3 months. His name was Wendell Crane. He folded his hands the way men do when they've already decided how a conversation is going to end. He told me Harlan County Agricultural Lending had worked with my grandfather's estate for 11 years. He told me they had a great deal of respect for what my family had built out there on Route 9. Then he paused. The way people pause when the word "but" is about to do a lot of work. But a farm that size, 112 acres, an outstanding note of $41,000, a primary residence the county assessor flagged in October. That's not a beginner situation, miss. You have 30 days. What Wendell Crane didn't know, what nobody in that town knew, was that my grandfather had left me a note. 3 words on the back of a seed catalog in handwriting that shook a little at the end. Look in the cellar, and what I found down there would bury Wendell Crane and everyone he was protecting. The banker didn't even look up when I walked in. He was reading something on his desk head, bent low, the buzzing fluorescent light above him catching the thin spot at the crown of his head where the hair had given up years ago. He made me stand there for a full 30 seconds before he gestured at the chair across from him like he was doing me a favor. The chair was vinyl, cracked at the seam, cold through my jeans. I was 19 years old. I had driven 40 minutes in a truck with a cracked defroster on a Thursday morning in February, wearing my grandfather's barn coat, because my own coat wasn't warm enough for Wisconsin in winter. The coat still smelled like him, diesel and hay, and something I couldn't name that was just him. My grandfather had been dead 3 months. His name was Wendell Crane. The brass plate on his desk said so screwed into a piece of fake wood that had been trying to pass for oak since 1987. He folded his hands the way men do when they've already decided how a conversation is going to end. Miss Wexford. He said my name like he was checking a box on a form. Harlan County Agricultural Lending has worked with your grandfather's estate for 11 years. We have a great deal of respect for what your family built out there on Route 9. Then he paused. The way people pause when the word "but" is about to do a lot of work. But a farm that size, 112 acres, an outstanding note of $41,000, a primary residence the county assessor flagged in October. He let that hang in the air between us. That's not a beginner's situation, miss. We're going to need a formal response within 30 days. I sat very still. My hands were in my lap, hidden under the desk where he couldn't see them. They were not steady. The heat in the building was turned up too high, the way they always turn it up too high in banks in February, like they want you to feel small and sweating and aware of every disadvantage you brought through the door with you. "I'm not a beginner," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Wendell Crane smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. That would have been easier to fight. It was the smile of a man who had already heard everything I was about to say and had a folder somewhere in his desk drawer with my exact response written down in advance. "I'm sure you're not Miss Wexford. I'm sure you're not." He stood up. The meeting was over. He hadn't even offered me water. I drove home on roads that were gray with old snow. The defroster cut out twice, and I had to scrape the inside of the windshield with my fingernail just to see 30 feet ahead of me. The sky was that particular shade of February white that isn't really clouds, just a general refusal of light. I sat in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. The farmhouse sat at the end of a quarter-mile gravel lane off Route 9, just outside Creek Bend, Wisconsin. Population 2,400, give or take. The kind of town where people knew your grandfather's name before they knew your face, and where they decided what you were made of based on whether your truck got stuck in the mud at the end of your own driveway. My grandfather had bought those 112 acres in 1979 for $60,000, which everyone at the time said was too much. He had grown corn and soybeans on the back 40. Kept a small dairy operation going until the mid-90s, then pivoted to vegetable production and direct sales in a way that most of his neighbors considered eccentric and mildly suspicious. He had died on the 4th of November the previous year, on a Tuesday, between breakfast and lunch, in the kitchen where I was now sitting. He left me everything: the house, the land, the equipment, the debt, and 11 laying hens who had not yet been given names because my grandfather did not name chickens on principle. He also left me a note. It was written on the back of a seed catalog in handwriting that shook a little at the end. The note said 3 things. "Don't sell. Look in the cellar first. But not yet. Wait until you're ready." I had not gone into the cellar yet. I told myself this was practical. The cellar stairs were steep, and the light fixture at the bottom had a pull chain that required you to navigate 4 steps blind before you could reach it. I had confirmed this the previous afternoon by opening the cellar door, looking down into the dark, and then going back to the kitchen to eat crackers and spreadable cheese that I had brought from Ithaca. The real reason was simpler. The note was the last thing my grandfather had ever written. Going into the cellar meant following the instruction, and following the instruction meant the note was finished. The way a book is finished when you reach the last page. And I wasn't ready for the note to be finished yet. I made coffee on the gas range, standing in my socks on the cold linoleum. I stood at the kitchen window over the sink and watched the yard. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 19 degrees. The hens, still nameless on principle, were moving around inside their coop, and I could see the slow puffs of their breath through the chicken wire. I thought about Wendell Crane. 30 days. $41,000. A house that the assessor had flagged for the roof leak over the back addition, the dark stain that was spreading slow and patient across the plaster ceiling of the second bedroom. I thought about the conversation at the bank, and I thought about the way Crane had said the word miss, like a small correction, like a reminder that I was a thing being addressed, not a person being heard. And I thought about my grandfather, Silas Wexford, 81 years old when he died. A man who labeled every jar in the root cellar with a date and a description in careful slanting cursive. A man who organized his tools by logic and moved them back into place without comment when they wandered. A man who had written me a note that said, "Don't sell," and had then apparently left me with no money to do anything else. That afternoon, I made my first list. It was in a green spiral notebook I had bought at the Creek Bend Hardware on my way back from the bank. The first column said, "What I know." The second column said, "What I need to know." The first column had 3 items. $41,000 owed. 30 days. Roof leak. The second column had 36 items, and I stopped writing because my hand cramped. I had been in the farmhouse for 5 days. I had driven down from Ithaca on a Saturday, 3 days after the letter from the estate attorney arrived in the mailbox of the apartment I shared with 2 other girls near the campus I had stopped attending in October. I had stopped attending Cornell in October because my grandfather had called me on a Thursday evening and said in the tired and matter-of-fact voice of a man who had already accepted what he was about to say, that he had been to the doctor in Eau Claire that morning, that there were things wrong with him that the doctor could put names to, and a few things wrong that the doctor could not. He had told me not to come home. He had told me he was fine. He had told me to finish the semester. I had finished the semester the way a person finishes a glass of water they don't want to drink, mechanically, without tasting it. And then I had told no one, not my roommates, not the registrar, not my advisor, that I was not coming back in the spring. My grandfather died on November 4th. The funeral was small. November in Creek Bend. Maybe 40 people in the cemetery behind the Lutheran church, most of them older than 70, all of them wearing the same kind of dark wool coats that had been hanging in the same kind of mudrooms for 40 years. A man I didn't recognize had stood at the back. Tall, older, maybe 78, white hair cut short. He didn't come up to me afterward. He stood at a distance watching the grave, and when I looked over again 10 minutes later, he was gone. I hadn't thought about him since. The wood stove in the kitchen was running low. I crossed to it and added 2 split logs from the pile by the door. My grandfather had known that stove the way you know a person's moods after 30 years. I was still learning its first name. I sat back down at the table with my green notebook and stared at the second column. And that was when I heard the truck. It was an old engine. The sound of a vehicle that had been turned over for the first time on a winter morning and had developed opinions about it. It came up the gravel lane slow and deliberate, the way someone drives when they're not sure whether they're welcome but have decided to come anyway. I stood up and went to the window. The truck was a green Ford F-25, maybe 20 years old, with a dent in the front quarter panel that someone had painted over without bothering to pull. It pulled up next to my grandfather's truck and stopped. The driver sat in the cab for a moment, hands on the wheel, looking at the house. Then he got out. He was tall, older, white hair cut short. He was wearing a brown canvas coat that had seen at least 2 decades of work, and he moved with the particular slow stiffness of a man whose knees had decided to keep going, but were charging him for the privilege. It was the man from the funeral. He walked up to the porch and stopped at the bottom step. He didn't come up. He just stood there, hat in his hand, looking at the door. I opened it before he had a chance to knock. He looked at me. His eyes were a pale gray, the color of the February sky, and for a moment he didn't say anything. He just looked at me the way you look at someone when you are seeing 2 people at once. The person in front of you and the person they remind you of. "You'd be Hadley," he said. His voice was lower than I expected, quieter, like he had spent a lot of his life learning not to take up more sound than he needed. "I am," I said. "My name is Otis Brennan. I knew your grandfather for 50 years. I live 2 miles down the road." He paused. "I came by to see if your generator's running. We're supposed to get weather Friday." I stepped back from the door. "You want to come in?" I said. He didn't answer right away. He looked past me into the kitchen, the notebook on the table, the mug with the green stripe, the wood stove giving off its steady, tired heat. "If you'll allow it." He took off his boots at the mudroom. He set them side by side on the mat, the way someone who has been a guest in this house before knows to do. He hung his coat on the 3rd hook from the left, which was the hook my grandfather had always used. He did not seem to notice that he had done this. His body knew before his mind did. He sat at the kitchen table and didn't say anything when I poured him coffee. He didn't ask for cream. He didn't ask for sugar. He held the mug in both hands the way old men do when their fingers have decided that warm things are the best things. And he looked at the wood stove for a moment before he looked at me. "The generator," he said. "Front shed, front shed. When did you last run it?" "I haven't," I said. "I don't know how." He nodded, like he had expected this answer. Like he had driven over with the expectation that this answer would be exactly the one I gave. "It's not complicated. I'll show you. Friday's coming in colder than what we've had. You lose power out here, that house will drop to 40 degrees inside of 6 hours. "Okay," I said. He drank his coffee. He looked around the kitchen the way a man looks at a room he has been inside of many times before, but is now seeing in a slightly different light. His eyes went to the catalog on the counter, the seed catalog, with my grandfather's note folded inside it. He looked at it for a long second. Then he looked at me. How are you finding things, Hadley? I almost laughed. I didn't. I went to the bank this morning, I said. I have 30 days. He nodded slowly. He didn't seem surprised. Wendell Crane. You know him. I've known Wendell Crane since he was 8 years old and stealing nickels from his father's coat pocket at the Lutheran potluck. He took a long sip of coffee. He hasn't improved much. I looked at him for a moment. I did not yet know what to do with Otis Brennan. He was sitting in my grandfather's chair, drinking from my grandfather's mug, talking about my grandfather's banker, in the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time to have this exact conversation. I asked him the only question I had. How well did you know him? He set the mug down. He looked at the wood stove again. He took a breath that I could hear from across the table. I knew Silas Wexford, he said, longer than I knew my own brother. And there are things he was carrying, things he didn't put down in 50 years. And I expect in the time you've got here, you're going to find some of them. He looked at me. And when you do, you come find me, and we'll talk. He showed me the generator that afternoon. He showed me 3 times because he understood without being told that the first showing was for the explanation, the second was for the doing, and the third was for the muscle memory. He had me start it, run it, shut it down, and prime it again. He stood with his hands in his pockets while I did it, and he didn't speak unless I missed a step. When he left at 4 o'clock, the sky was already going dark. He stopped at the porch and turned back. There's a note in that catalog on the counter, he said. I saw it through the doorway. I waited. Have you done what it says? Not yet, I said. He nodded. He wouldn't have told you to wait if there wasn't a reason. He got into his truck and drove away. I watched the taillights disappear down the gravel lane, and I stood on the porch in my grandfather's barn coat until I couldn't feel my hands. Then I went inside, and I went down to the cellar. The stairs creaked the way old stairs creak, not in protest, in recognition. The kind of sound a house makes when it remembers your weight. I navigated the 4 steps blind found the pull chain and yanked it. A single bulb came on overhead, 60 watts maybe, hanging from a cloth-covered wire that looked older than I was. The cellar was long and narrow. Stone walls, packed dirt floor. The air tasted of earth and mineral cold, and somewhere to my left, the faint humming presence of the old chest freezer my grandfather had kept running for as long as I could remember. Along the east wall were the mason jars I already knew about. Tomatoes, green beans, pickled beets in the colors of stained glass. Every jar had a date in his careful slanting cursive. I walked the length of the cellar slowly, looking. I was not yet sure what I was looking for. The note had said, "Look in the cellar first." But the cellar was full of things. 40 years of canning, 2 old wooden crates of apples turning slowly to dust. A workbench against the south wall covered with cobwebs and a few rusted tools. A coal chute that had been bricked up since the 1960s. I stood in the middle of the room and turned in a slow circle. And then I saw it. On the workbench, pushed all the way to the back, behind a coffee can of washers and a stack of old paint cans. A wooden box. It was small, maybe 12 inches by 8. Pine, by the look of it, darkened with age. There were initials carved into the lid. Not deep, just enough that you could feel them with your thumb. S.W. Silas Wexford. My hands were shaking when I reached for it. I told myself it was the cold. The box was not locked. The brass hinges had gone green at the edges, and the lid lifted with a quiet stiffness that suggested it had not been opened in a long time. Inside, wrapped in a square of dark blue felt, was a medal, a bronze star. It was the first one I had ever held. My grandfather had never spoken about his service. Not once. Not in 19 years. I had known in the vague way that children know things that he had been in the army. I had known he had served somewhere in the late 1960s. I had known that the answer to any direct question about it would be a redirection, gentle but absolute, the kind of redirection that closes a door without slamming it. I had never asked twice. I held the medal in my palm. It was heavier than I expected. Cold. The ribbon had faded from red and white to a softer rust and cream. Underneath the medal, folded once at the center, was a photograph. Black and white, glossy paper that had begun to curl at the corners. 5 young men in fatigues standing in front of a low wooden building in what looked like a desert. Sand stretching out behind them, a pale sky. The kind of light that flattens everything. 5 men, all young, all looking at the camera with the particular flat expression of soldiers who have learned not to smile for photographs. I recognized my grandfather, second from the left. He was 28 years old in this picture, maybe 29. His face was thinner than I had ever known it. His eyes were the same. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting I recognized as his, were 11 words. 5 of us went in. 3 came home wrong. The debt remains. I sat down on the cellar floor. I sat down because my legs had stopped agreeing to hold me up, and because the dirt was cold, and because there was nowhere else to sit. I read the words again, and again, and again. The debt remains. I thought of Wendell Crane that morning, folding his hands, saying the word debt like a weight to be measured against me. This was a different debt. I understood that without being told. This was the debt my grandfather had carried in silence for 50 years. And it was the debt I had felt the shape of every time I had looked at him across the dinner table and known there were rooms inside him I had never been allowed into. I sat in the cellar for a long time. Eventually I got up. I put the medal and the photograph back in the box. I carried the box upstairs and set it on the kitchen table next to the green notebook. Then I added a new line to the What I Need to Know column. Who were the other 4 men? The next morning, I drove into Creek Bend. I needed feed for the hens, salt for the steps, and a roll of duct tape to do something temporary about the leak over the back bedroom until I could afford something permanent. I was learning fast that the word temporary was going to do a lot of work in my life for the foreseeable future. The hardware store was on Main Street, and the Lutheran church was at the end of Main Street, and between them there was a long stretch of sidewalk that I had not walked alone since I was 12 years old. Creek Bend was a town where people knew you by your grandfather's name, and being seen walking down Main Street alone in February in your grandfather's coat was a slow public announcement that things had changed. Marjorie Doyle saw me first. She was coming out of the post office with a stack of envelopes in her hands. 73 years old, maybe 74. A small woman, sharp-featured, with the kind of gray hair that has been kept the same length and the same shape for so many years that it has become a structural element of her face. She stopped when she saw me. Hadley Wexford. Yes, ma'am. She crossed the sidewalk. She didn't smile. Marjorie Doyle was not a smiler. She had been the librarian at the Creek Bend Public Library for 31 years, and she had retired in 2019, and she had the bearing of a woman who had spent her career deciding what was true and what was not, and was not going to start being uncertain now. I was sorry to hear about your grandfather. Thank you. He came into the library every Tuesday for 20 years. I didn't know that, I said. She looked at me for a long second. Her eyes were small and dark and very sharp. He was researching something. I waited. She did not continue. Instead, she said, "When you're ready to know about it, you come and find me. I keep regular hours. I'm at the church basement Wednesdays. The Historical Society, 2 to 4. She put her gloved hand on my arm for the briefest moment. Don't wait too long, Hadley. She walked past me toward the parking lot. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the post office with a list in my pocket and a feeling in my chest that I could not yet name. The feeling that the town of Creek Bend had been holding its breath for a long time, and that my grandfather's death had not let it out, and that I was now standing in the middle of a story that had been written down somewhere I had not yet found. I drove home with the feed and the salt and the duct tape, and I did not stop at the church basement. Not yet. 2 days later, the letter came. It was Saturday. The mail truck pulled up to the box at the end of the lane around 11, and I walked down to get it, because walking down the lane was one of the things I had started doing on purpose to make sure that my legs remembered what work felt like. Most of what was in the box was junk. A flyer from a tractor dealership in La Crosse. A piece of mail for my grandfather from the AARP that I did not yet know what to do with, and one envelope, cream-colored, heavy stock. Return address in Chicago, a law firm. I opened it standing at the end of the lane with the wind cutting through my coat. The letter was from a firm I did not recognize, representing a person I did not recognize named Royce Wexford, who, according to the letter, was my grandfather's younger brother. 64 years old, living in Chicago, and who, the letter informed me, had taken the liberty of having his attorneys reach out to express his sincere condolences and his interest in discussing the future of the family property at his earliest convenience. The phrase, "the future of the family property," was underlined. I had never heard of Royce Wexford. In 19 years, my grandfather had never once mentioned a brother. Not in passing, not in anger, not in any of the long winter evenings when he and I had sat at the kitchen table and he had told me stories about his life in pieces here and there, the way old men give you the parts they want you to have. There had been no brother. I read the letter twice. I read the address. I read the phone number printed at the bottom. I did not call. I went back into the house and I put the letter on the kitchen table next to the wooden box and the green notebook and the seed catalog with my grandfather's note inside it. 3 pieces of paper, 1 box, 1 photograph. The shape of a story that someone had been keeping from me my whole life. That afternoon, I started looking through the rest of the house. Not searching exactly. My grandfather had been a man who labeled, a man who organized by logic. If there were more things to find, they would be in places that made sense, and my job was to learn his system well enough to see the sense. I started with the desk in the front room. The drawers were neat, bills filed by month, a folder for veterinary records on the dairy operation dating back to 1991, a folder for property taxes, a folder for the well, everything in its place. The bottom drawer was locked. It was a small lock, the kind you can buy at any hardware store, and which is more about the idea of locking than the practice of it. I checked the obvious places for a key: the pencil cup, the underside of the desk, the lip of the drawer above. Nothing. I sat back in the chair and looked around the room. My grandparents' wedding photograph was on the wall above the desk. It had hung there my whole life, black and white. My grandmother, Eleanor, in a knee-length dress holding a small bouquet. My grandfather, Silas, in a dark suit, standing with the particular straight-backed stillness of a man who had been told to stand still and was taking the instruction very seriously. She had died when I was 4. I did not remember her. I stood up and crossed to the photograph. I lifted it off the wall. Taped to the back of the frame with a single strip of yellowed masking tape was a small brass key. Below the key, in handwriting I now knew very well, was a note on the back of the tape: "For when you're ready to know who I was." I held the key in my palm. I thought of my grandfather. I thought of the way he had laughed sometimes when I was small. A small, dry laugh, almost a cough, that he saved for jokes he made to himself that I never understood. I thought of his hands on the steering wheel of the truck when we drove into town together on Saturdays. I thought of the way he had taught me to crack an egg with one hand, holding my smaller hand in his, showing me the wrist motion patient through 11 failed attempts. I thought of the things I did not know about him, and I understood for the first time that the not knowing had been a kind of love. He had been protecting me from something for 19 years, and the protection was now finished. The key fit the bottom drawer of the desk. I turned it slowly. The lock gave with a small mechanical click that sounded in the quiet of the front room like a door opening somewhere far away. Inside the drawer were two things: a bank ledger, handwritten, dating back to 1972, and a single piece of paper folded once with my name written on the outside in pencil. I unfolded the paper first. It was short. 6 lines. Hadley, if you found this, you're standing in the front room, and you're alone, and you have already met Otis. I'm sorry for what comes next. It is not your work to do, but I'm afraid it has fallen to you anyway. The barn at the north end of the property has a padlock on the door. The key is in the kitchen in the box under the coat hooks. When you go inside, you will understand what I have been doing for 50 years. And you will understand why the debt remains. I'm proud of you, Hadley. I have always been proud of you. Grandpa. I sat in his chair in the front room of his house in the middle of a February afternoon in Wisconsin, and I read the note 3 times. Then I picked up the ledger. It was a Mead composition book, black and white marbled cover, the same kind he had used for everything. I opened it to the first page. The first entry was dated April 11th, 1972. A name and address in Tucson, Arizona. A dollar amount, $200. The second entry was dated June 3rd, 1972. A name and address in Cedar City, Utah. A dollar amount, $150. The third entry was dated September 18th, 1972. A name and address in Las Cruces, New Mexico. A dollar amount, $250. I turned the page. There were more entries. Many more. Page after page after page. Names, addresses, dates, dollar amounts. All across the Southwest. Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, a few in Nevada, a few in Southern California. The amounts grew over the years. 200 became 500. 500 became 1,000. There were entries every few months, every year. Every year. Every year going back almost 50 years. I flipped to the last page. The final entry was dated September 17th, 2021, 7 weeks before he died. A name in Tucson. A dollar amount. $2,000. I added up the totals in my head as far as I could before the numbers got away from me. Conservatively, carefully. He had sent more than $180,000 over the course of 50 years to people I had never heard of in places he had never visited for reasons I did not yet understand. This was where the money had gone. This was why the farm carried debt. This was why the roof leaked. He had been sending the operating margin of 112 acres in Wisconsin year after year to 3 states in the American Southwest for half a century. I closed the ledger. I sat in his chair, and I looked at the wedding photograph on the wall, and I thought of the box in the kitchen with the medal and the photograph and the 11 words on the back. 5 of us went in. 3 came home wrong. The debt remains. I went to the kitchen. I went to the mudroom, to the small wooden box nailed to the wall beneath the coat hooks. The box I had looked into on my first day in the house and dismissed as empty. The box my grandfather had told me about indirectly in a note I had not yet finished reading. I lifted the lid. Taped to the inside bottom of the box with a strip of black electrical tape that had gone brittle at the edges was a key. It was a small brass key, greenish at the teeth. The bow was oval, nothing decorative, just functional. The kind of key a hardware store would cut in 30 seconds from a blank. Underneath the key on a strip of masking tape, my grandfather had written one word, North. I stood in the mudroom with the key in my palm. I thought of Wendell Crane and his 30-day clock. I thought of the letter from a man named Royce Wexford in Chicago, who was apparently my great-uncle, and who had reached out through attorneys exactly 6 days after the news of my grandfather's death had become public record. I thought of Otis Brennan, the man who had stood at the back of the funeral and who had driven over to teach me how to start the generator on a Thursday in February, and who had said very quietly that when I was ready, I should come find him. I thought of Marjorie Doyle, who had told me on a sidewalk in front of the post office that my grandfather had come into her library every Tuesday for 20 years to research something. I thought of the ledger, and I thought of the barn at the north end of the property, the one I had noticed on my first morning. The one with the padlock that someone had chosen deliberately. I put on my grandfather's coat. I put the key in the front pocket, and I walked out into the February afternoon across the yard, past the chicken coop, past the equipment shed, past the wood pile toward the north barn that I had not yet entered. The one that held whatever it was my grandfather had been doing in the dark, alone for 50 years. The sky was the color of old tin. The wind had picked up from the northwest, and I understood walking across the frozen ground in his coat with his key in my pocket that I was no longer the same person who had walked into Wendell Crane's office 5 days earlier. I was someone new. I had not chosen to become her. But she was the only person who could finish what was waiting for me inside that barn. The padlock was a master, the heavy kind, with a shrouded shackle that would not give to a hammer. There was rust at the hinge point, but not much. The cold had slowed everything down out here, and the lock had the look of something that had been opened occasionally by careful hands. I put the key in. It did not turn on the first try. I had to hold the lock body still with my left hand and apply a slight upward pressure with my thumb. and then the shackle rose, and the lock opened with a sound like a single quiet exhale. I unhooked it from the hasp and set it on the snow. I stood at the threshold for a long moment before I pushed the door open. I think I knew even before I went inside that I was about to cross a line I could not cross back over. Some doors are like that. You put your hand on them, and the hand knows before the mind does. The body understands before the language catches up. I pushed the door open. The hinges complained the way old hinges do when they have not been asked to work in a few months. The door swung inward maybe 12 inches before it caught on something, and I had to push harder, leaning my shoulder into it until it gave the rest of the way. The smell came first, not rot. I want to be clear about that. Not rot, something older and drier. Paper mostly, old paper and ink, and the faint resinous edge of cedar that someone had used to line the walls. There was the smell of cold metal, the way an unheated tool shed smells in winter. And something underneath all of it, fainter but persistent, that I could only describe as the smell of a man who had spent 50 years inside a room thinking about the same thing. The light came through 2 small windows on the east wall, each one hazed with grime and cobweb. I had to stand still for almost a full minute before my eyes adjusted enough to see. The barn was not what I had expected. I had expected storage. Hay, old equipment, the kind of things you put behind a padlock because you don't want raccoons in them. What I saw was a workshop. The floor was packed dirt, swept clean, dark in the center, where foot traffic had pressed it down over years. A single workbench ran the length of the north wall, maybe 16 feet of it, the top surface clear except for a green-shaded desk lamp on a long arm, the kind you find in old engineering offices. The bench had been built to a careful height, the kind of height a man chooses when he plans to stand at it for a long time. Above the bench, mounted to the wall, was a corkboard. It was 8 feet wide, maybe more. Every inch of it was covered. I crossed the floor slowly. The boards under my feet made no sound, and that was because there were no boards. Just packed dirt and decades of footsteps. On the corkboard were photographs, documents, yellowed newspaper clippings, a large map of the American Southwest with pins stuck into it. 11 pins. Red. I leaned in. The pins were stuck into locations I recognized from the ledger. Tucson, Cedar City, Las Cruces. A pin near Flagstaff. A pin in the empty stretch of Nevada south of Tonopah. A pin near St. George, Utah. Each pin had a small paper tag tied to it. On each tag was a name and a date. The names matched the names in the ledger. The dates were not the dates of the payments. The dates were earlier, much earlier. Most of them clustered around the late 1960s and the early 1970s. I stepped back from the corkboard. I turned slowly in a full circle. Against the south wall was a wooden filing cabinet 4 drawers high. The labels on the drawers had been handwritten on white masking tape in my grandfather's careful slanting cursive. 1968 to 1975, 1976 to 1990, 1991 to 2005, 2006 to present. 53 years of files, 53 years of work. I stood in the middle of the barn, and I felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I crossed to the filing cabinet. I pulled open the top drawer. The files inside were hanging files green labeled by year. The first year was 1968. The folder for 1968 was thicker than any of the others in the drawer. I lifted it out and set it on the workbench under the green shaded lamp, and I pulled the chain. The light came on. It was a good light, bright, focused. The kind of light you choose when you have done a lot of reading in a small space. I opened the folder. The first page was a photocopy of a typed military document. The reproduction was poor. The original had been a carbon copy, and the carbon had not been fresh. But the words were legible. It was a memo, dated June 14th, 1968, from a Lieutenant Colonel Thaddeus Crane, Commanding Officer, Camp Bishop Training Facility, Nye County, Nevada. Subject line, Chemical Defense Exercise Authorization. Subject Group D, Civilian Observation Site, Echo. I read it 3 times. I did not understand all of the language. I understood enough. In June of 1968, at a remote training facility in southern Nevada, an exercise had been conducted involving the deliberate release of a non-lethal incapacitating agent, a test agent. The subjects of the exercise had been a small group of enlisted men from a training rotation. The observers of the exercise had been civilian contractors employed by a construction firm hired to expand the facility's perimeter. The exercise had not gone as planned. The agent had been more potent than the specifications had indicated. The wind had shifted. The civilian contractors had not been informed of the exercise in advance and had not been issued protective equipment. They had been working in a low canyon 2 miles southeast of the test site. 17 men had been exposed. 5 of them died within 90 days. The rest were instructed not to speak about what had happened. I sat down on the stool in front of the workbench. I read the memo again. There was a second document, a casualty list. 5 names. Civilian construction workers, ages 31 to 56, all American, all employed by a firm out of Las Vegas that had since been dissolved. I recognized none of the names, but I recognized the form, the pattern. 5 men, civilians, the Southwest, the fingerprints of the thing my grandfather had been doing for 50 years. I went back to the corkboard. I looked at the pins. 11 pins, 11 families. Each one a household that had lost a husband, a father, a brother, in a single 90-day window in the summer and fall of 1968, to a thing that had never been publicly acknowledged. For 50 years, my grandfather had been finding these families, locating them, tracking them across state lines and through divorces and second marriages and changes of address. And he had been sending them money, quietly, steadily, every year, every year, every year, year after year after year. I sat down on the dirt floor in the middle of his workshop. I sat down because my body would no longer agree to stand. I do not remember crying. I remember only the dirt floor under my hands and the green light from the desk lamp and the slow recognition that the man I had thought I knew, the silent, careful man who had taught me to crack an egg with one hand, had been carrying a weight I would not have been able to carry myself. He had been a witness. He had been one of the soldiers. He had been there. He had survived, and 4 other men had not. I sat on the floor for a long time before I got up. When I did, I went back to the file cabinet. I pulled the second drawer open. I started reading. I read until the sun went down, and then I lit the desk lamp brighter, and I kept reading, and I did not eat dinner, and I did not check on the hens, and I did not look at the clock. I read until I understood. By the time I closed the last folder, the wind had picked up outside, and the barn was full of a deep cold that the small lamp could not push back. My fingers ached. My shoulders ached. My eyes felt scraped. I had read 53 years of work in the space of one evening, and I knew now with the certainty of a thing seen plainly what my grandfather had been doing. He had been keeping a record of names, dates, addresses, and amounts, a record of the 11 families, a record of the chain of command that had authorized the exercise, a record of the way the casualty list had been quietly reclassified as a workplace accident, and the way the construction firm had been dissolved, and the way the men who had survived had been threatened with prosecution under the Espionage Act if they ever spoke about what they had seen. He had been keeping a record so that someone eventually could prove it. He had not been able to prove it himself, but he had been getting closer. The last folder in the cabinet, the one labeled 2021, contained 6 letters. They were responses to inquiries my grandfather had submitted under the Freedom of Information Act. They were dated between January and August of 2021. Each one was a partial release. Each one had been heavily redacted, but each one confirmed in small pieces the existence of a thing that had been officially denied for 53 years. He had been close to having enough. He had died before he got there. I closed the folder. I turned off the lamp. I locked the padlock behind me and walked across the frozen yard to the farmhouse. And when I got inside, I did not turn on any lights. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark in his coat, and I did not move for a long time. The next morning, I drove to Otis Brennan's house. I had not called ahead. I did not yet have a phone number for him. I drove the 2 miles down the road slowly in my grandfather's truck, and I pulled into a gravel driveway that ran past a small white farmhouse with a green metal roof. There was smoke coming from the chimney. There was an old Ford pickup parked next to the porch. Otis came out before I had the truck in park. He stood on the porch in his shirt sleeves, and he looked at me through the windshield, and his face did something I have not forgotten. It softened, just for a moment, as if he had been waiting a long time for me to come up that driveway and was relieved that I finally had. I got out of the truck. I crossed the yard. I stopped at the bottom step. "I have been in the barn," I said. He nodded slowly. "Come inside, Hadley." His kitchen was small and warm and smelled like coffee that had been on the burner for too long. There was a wood stove in the corner, smaller than ours, and a black dog asleep on a folded blanket beside it. The dog opened one eye when I came in, considered me, and closed it again. Otis poured me coffee without asking. He pushed the mug across the table. He sat down across from me, and he did not speak. He waited. I told him what I had read. I told him about Camp Bishop, about the exercise, about the 17 men, about the 5 who had died and the 12 who had been told to stay quiet, about the ledger, about the cork board, about the 11 pins and the 53 years of payments. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I was finished, he looked at the surface of the table for a long moment. Then he looked up. "I was there," he said. I had known. From the second I had seen his face on the porch yesterday morning, with the gray sky behind him and his hat in his hand, I had known. But hearing him say it was different. Hearing him say it made the thing real in a way that the documents had not yet made it real.
There were 5 of us in that picture, Hadley. 5 of us who came out of Camp Bishop and were told to keep our mouths shut. 2 of us died of cancer inside 10 years. 1 man took his own life in 1981. That left your grandfather, and it left me. He looked at his coffee.
For 50 years, your grandfather did what he could. He could not undo what had happened, but he could find the families of those civilian men, the ones who lost husbands and fathers because the United States Army was testing something on its own soil and lied about it afterward. He found them one at a time over decades. Most of them did not know what had really killed their men. They knew there had been an accident at a construction site. They knew the company had folded and the insurance had been a fraction of what it should have been. They knew their lives had become harder. They did not know why. He paused. Silas could not tell them why. He did not have the proof, and he did not have the protection, and if he had spoken about it before, he had the documents in his hand, the people responsible would have buried him under their own version of the story. So, he did the only thing he could. He sent them money, quietly. He paid into their lives every year. He did it for 50 years. And he kept the record so that someone someday could finish what he had started. I waited. Otis looked up at me.
I think you know who that someone is now.
I did. I had known since the moment I had closed the last folder in the cabinet. It was me. I drove home through a slow snow that had started while I was inside Otis's kitchen. The flakes were small and dry, and they did not stick to the windshield. They moved across the road like dust. I thought about the name in the memo. Lieutenant Colonel Thaddeus Crane.
I had read it 3 times last night. I had written it down in my green notebook. I had stared at it, and I had told myself in the cellar cold light of the workshop that it was a common enough last name, that there had been many Cranes in many places, that the man who had signed that memo in 1968 had nothing to do with the man who had sat across from me in a bank office 4 days earlier and told me I had 30 days to sell my grandfather's land.
I had told myself this last night because I had been too tired to think clearly. In the truck driving home through the dry snow, I stopped telling myself that. I went to the kitchen as soon as I got in the house. I picked up the green notebook. I wrote 2 words next to the Crane name. Wendell, Father. Then I wrote a 3rd word, confirm. That afternoon, I drove into Creek Bend. I went to the church basement. It was Wednesday. Marjorie Doyle had told me she kept regular hours on Wednesdays, 2 to 4, at the Historical Society.
The church basement smelled like coffee and old carpet. The Historical Society took up half of the space, the other half being a Sunday school room with miniature chairs stacked along one wall. The Historical Society had 3 folding tables pushed together in the center, and a wall of metal shelving along the back, and Marjorie Doyle sitting at a card table near the door with a stack of binders open in front of her. She looked up when I came in. She did not smile, but her face did something close to softening. The way her face had probably been doing things close to softening for a long time for people who needed it but would not ask. Sit down, Hadley. I sat. She closed the binder she had been reading. She folded her hands on top of it. Tell me what you found. I told her. Most of it. Not all of it. Just enough. The barn, the files, the map with the pins, the ledger, the bronze star and the photograph and the 11 words. She listened without expression. When I finished, she nodded once. 20 years, she said. He came in every Tuesday afternoon for 20 years. He sat at that table by the window. He asked me to pull microfilm. He asked me to help him track down newspaper archives from small towns in 3 states. He asked me to find out which civilian contracts had been awarded for federal facilities in the Southwest between 1966 and 1970. He asked me to find next of kin notifications. He asked me to help him locate people Hadley. Year after year, people. She paused. He never told me why. I looked at her. You knew it was something. I knew it was something. She nodded slowly. I have been a librarian for 51 years, Hadley. I know the difference between a man researching a hobby and a man researching a debt. Your grandfather
was researching a debt, and he was researching it carefully, and he was researching it for a long time, and I respected him too much to ever ask him what it was. She stood up. She crossed to the wall of metal shelving and pulled down a banker's box from the third shelf. She set it on the card table between us. He left this here 4 years ago. He told me to keep it for him. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I was to give it to whoever came looking for it. He said I would know who that was when she walked in. He said her name would be Hadley. She slid the box across the table. I lifted the lid. Inside were copies. Carbon copies and Xerox copies and a stack of dot matrix printouts. Everything I had seen in the barn last night. Every document. Every file. Every name on every pin. He had made a duplicate set. He had hidden it 4 years ago in the basement of the Lutheran church with a woman he trusted, so that if anything happened to the original, the work would survive. I looked up at Marjorie Doyle. She was watching me with an expression I could not read. He was a careful man, your grandfather.
He was, I said.
He was also, she said, the most stubborn man I ever met, and I was married to a Norwegian dairy farmer for 41 years, so understand what that judgment costs me. She sat back down. Tell me what you need, Hadley. I left the church basement at 4:15 with the banker's box on the passenger seat of the truck. I drove home in the early dark of a February afternoon, and I thought about Wendell Crane, and I thought about the 30-day clock, and I thought about the way the world had become a smaller and more pointed place in the last 72 hours. The next afternoon, the black town car came up the gravel lane. It was a Lincoln, new, polished black, the kind of car that does not belong on a Wisconsin gravel road in February and is announcing by its presence that it does not intend to. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. I went to the window over the sink. The driver opened the back door and a man got out. He was 64 years old. I knew that because I had read it in the letter. He was wearing a charcoal overcoat and leather gloves and the kind of shoes that men in Chicago wear and men in Creek Bend do not. He looked at the house for a long moment. He looked at the chicken coop. He looked at the equipment shed. He looked like my grandfather.
That was the thing that hit me first, before anything else, before the overcoat and the car and the Chicago shoes.
He looked like Silas Wexford. The same jawline, the same set of the shoulders, the same particular straight-backed stillness. He was 20 years younger, and he had not done a day of physical work in 40 years. But the resemblance was unmistakable. He came up the steps. He knocked on the door. I opened it. Hadley. His voice was warm, surprisingly warm, the kind of warmth that has been practiced.
I'm Royce. I am your great uncle. I am terribly sorry to arrive unannounced.
He held out his hand. I did not take it. He smiled, just a small smile. He lowered his hand without seeming to mind. May I come in? It's quite cold. I stepped back from the door.
He came into the kitchen the way a person comes into a place he has never been before, but has decided in advance not to be impressed by. He looked at the wood stove. He looked at the kitchen table. He looked at the seed catalog on the counter. He did not. I noticed look at the wooden box. The wooden box was not on the table anymore. I had put it in the front room 2 days ago. He sat without being invited. I made coffee. I did this because I needed something to do with my hands. He talked while I made it. He talked about traffic on I-94. He talked about the snow in Chicago. He talked about a restaurant in Milwaukee where he had stopped for breakfast that morning, and about how good the omelets had been, and about how it had reminded him of a place in Eau Claire that he used to go to with his brother in the 1970s. His brother. He said the word easily. He said it like the word had not been buried in silence for the entire 19 years of my life. I set the coffee in front of him. I sat down across from him. I did not pour any for myself. Hadley. He folded his hands on the table. His hands were soft, manicured. The hands of a man who paid other men to do the things that calloused hands do. I want to begin by saying that I understand why you might be confused by my reaching out. Your grandfather and I had a difficult relationship. There were reasons for that. Reasons that are not, I think, your burden to carry. He looked at me. I would like to help you. I did not say anything. He took a small black folder from the inside pocket of his coat. He laid it on the table. He opened it. Inside was a check. I could see the number from across the table. $350,000. Hadley. His voice was very gentle. I know what this place means to you. I do. I grew up here. Until I was 16 years old, this was my home. I understand what it would mean to lose it. But I also understand what the situation is. The debt, the repairs, the cost of running a farm of this size with no equipment and no labor and no experience. These things are not solvable by goodwill. They are solvable by capital. I would like to give you that capital. I am offering to purchase the property at well above its assessed value, at a number that will allow you to walk away with a substantial sum, to return to your studies, to make a life elsewhere, to grieve in peace. He paused. I am not asking you to decide today. I am not asking you to decide this week. I am only asking you to consider it. I looked at him. I looked at the check. I looked at his hands. His hands were resting flat on the table on either side of the folder. They were perfectly still. I asked him only one question. When did you last see him? He blinked. It was a very small thing, almost no expression at all. But it was there. The smallest flicker, like a shutter,
clicking, like a man who had not been ready for that particular question and had needed half a second to choose the answer. It has been many years. How many? Hadley, I don't think this is helpful. How many? He looked at me. The warmth was still on his face, but behind it for the first time, I could see the calculation. The way a man recalibrates when he understands that the conversation is not going the way he had planned. 1975, he said quietly. You have not seen your brother in 46 years. No. And now he is dead, I said. And you are here. With a check. 6 days after the obituary appeared in the paper. He was silent. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I had learned in the bank office that the loudest part of a conversation is not always the part you can hear. I would like you to leave, I said. He looked at me for a long second. Then he nodded. He closed the folder. He put it back inside his coat. He stood up. At the door with his hand on the knob, he paused. He did not turn around. Hadley. His voice was different now, quieter, the warmth gone. I want you to understand something. You are 19 years old. You are alone. You are out of money and you are out of time. And there are things in this house that you do not understand. There are things your grandfather was doing that he did not have the right to do. Things that other people care about. Things that other people will come looking for. I am not your enemy in this. I am the closest thing to a family member you have. I am offering you a way out. I am asking you with respect to take it. He turned then. He looked at me. Some debts, he said, are not yours to inherit. He walked out. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the car door close and the Lincoln pull away down the gravel lane. I stood there for a long time. Then I went to the front room. I picked up the photograph from the wedding day. My grandfather, 28 years old, standing next to my grandmother in a dark suit. I looked at his eyes. I looked at the line of his jaw. I looked at the way his hand rested at his side. I thought of Royce, 64 years old, the same jaw, the same shoulders, the same family, but not the same man. I sat in my grandfather's chair, and I understood then, with a kind of cold clarity that had nothing to do with grief, what Royce Wexford had been telling me. He had known. He had known about the barn. He had known about the files. He had known, perhaps for years, that his older brother had spent 50 years building a case that, when it was finally complete, would expose a chain of command stretching from a desert in Nevada to an office in Chicago to a bank in Creek Bend, Wisconsin. He had known, and he had stayed away for 46 years. He had stayed away from the brother who was doing the work, because being near it would have made him complicit. He had built his own life. He had become a man with manicured hands and a black Lincoln and breakfast at restaurants in Milwaukee. He had pretended for almost half a century that the work was not happening, and then his brother had died, and someone had told him that the work was still in the barn, and he had come. I sat in the chair for a long time, and I understood something else. He was not the only one who had come. Wendell Crane had come first. 6 days after the funeral with a 30-day clock. The son of Thaddeus Crane, the officer who had signed the memo in 1968. Wendell Crane, who had been waiting 50 years for the day when the last man who knew about that exercise would die, and who had then opened a folder on his desk and sent a letter to a 19-year-old girl in Ithaca, New York, demanding payment on a debt that had been carefully designed to be impossible to pay. I went to the kitchen. I picked up the green notebook. I turned to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote 4 words. They are all connected. Underneath, I wrote 3 names: Wendell Crane, Royce Wexford, Thaddeus Crane. Underneath the names, I wrote one more line. They want this to end with me selling the land. I closed the notebook. I stood at the kitchen window. The sun was going down. The thermometer on the porch post read 14 degrees and falling. The 11 hens were inside the coop, their heater coil running on the generator that Otis Brennan had taught me how to maintain. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the 50 years. I thought about the 11 families in the Southwest who had been receiving money every year from a man whose name they did not know for a reason that had never been explained to them. I thought about the 11 pins on the corkboard. I thought about the word debt. And I understood finally what my grandfather had meant. When he had written it in November of the previous year, with a hand that shook a little at the end, on the back of a seed catalog, 3 weeks before he died. The debt was not the $41,000. The debt was the truth. He had not been able to pay it himself. But he had spent 50 years saving up. And he had left me the receipts. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the green notebook and the wooden box and the letter from the Chicago law firm and the banker's box from Marjorie Doyle, and I read until the small hours of the morning. I read until the wood stove had burned down to coals twice, and I had built it back up twice, and the windows had gone from black to that pale gray color that February gives you before the sun has even thought about coming over the horizon. I made a decision. I made it slowly, the way you make decisions you cannot take back. I held it in my hands, and I turned it over, and I looked at it from several angles. And at 5 a.m, I sat down and wrote it out in 3 sentences in the green notebook, so that I could not pretend later that I had not decided it. I am not going to confront Wendell Crane. I am not going to sell. I am going to publish. The thing my grandfather had not been able to do. The thing he had spent 50 years preparing for someone else to do. I drove to Otis Brennan's house at 7 in the morning. The sun had come up, and the light was the color of weak tea on the snow. He was in the kitchen. He had 2 cups of coffee already poured when I came in, which told me he had heard the truck and had been waiting. I sat down across from him. I want to publish, I said. He looked at me over his coffee for a long second. What does that mean, Hadley? I told him I was going to find a journalist, a real one, someone with experience, someone with a paper behind them that could not be intimidated. I was going to give them the documents, all of them, the original set from the barn and the duplicate set from Marjorie. I was going to give them the names of the 11 families. I was going to give them the names of every officer in the chain of command. I was going to give them the memo. I was going to give them the FOIA responses my grandfather had collected over the last year of his life. I was going to put it in the newspaper. And once it was in the newspaper, Wendell Crane's leverage would be gone. The land would stop being a thing he needed to take from me. The debt would stop being a weapon. The story would belong to the country and not to him. Otis listened. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long minute. Then he said, "Your grandfather thought about this for years." I know. He could not do it himself. Why? Otis set his coffee down. He looked at me with those pale gray eyes that I had seen first at the funeral 3 months ago when I had not known what I was looking at. Because he was one of the men in the photograph. He had been threatened, Hadley, in 1969, 2 weeks after he was discharged. 2 men came to a hotel room in St. Paul where he was staying. They sat across from him at a small table, and they told him exactly what would happen to him and to his family and to anyone he ever spoke to about Camp Bishop, if he ever spoke to anyone about Camp Bishop. They named your great-grandmother. They named the address she was living at. They named her doctor. He understood sitting at that table that the threat was real. Otis paused. He spent the rest of his life building the case. He could not put his own name on it. He could not stand in front of a reporter and say I was there. The minute he did, the people on the other side would have produced their own story. They would have said he was a disgruntled soldier. They would have said he was sick. They would have said he was lying. And they would have buried him under it. And they would have made him into the story. And the 11 families would have been lost in the noise. He looked at me. He needed someone else to carry it. Someone who was not in the photograph. Someone whose name was not on any roster, whose discharge papers were not filed in any office, whose face was not in any military record from June of 1968. Someone who could walk into a newsroom and say, "Here are the documents," and not have to defend themselves. He paused for a long moment. He needed you, Hadley. I did not know what to say. Otis stood up. He walked to a small drawer beside the sink. He took out a manila envelope. It was thin. It had been folded once and tucked into the drawer for some time. He sat back down. He pushed the envelope across the table. "He wrote you a letter," he said, "a week before he died. He gave it to me to hold. He told me to give it to you when the time came. He told me I would know when. I did not pick it up right away. I looked at it." Otis nodded once. "This is when Hadley."
I picked up the envelope. I did not open it there. I could not have. Otis seemed to understand. He stood up and refilled my coffee, and he walked outside in his shirt sleeves to check the bird feeder on his porch, and he gave me the kitchen to myself for a few minutes. I opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages handwritten on plain white paper in pencil. The handwriting was the handwriting I knew, but it was weaker now. It shook a little. He had been a week from dying when he wrote it. "Hadley, if Otis has given you this, then you have found the barn, and the cellar, and the ledger, and the box, and you have decided to do the thing I could not do. I want you to know before you go any further that you can stop. You can put the documents in the wood stove and burn them tonight, and no one in the world will know what was inside them. The land will still be yours. Wendell Crane will still take it from you, but you will be alive and you will be free." And there are versions of a life that begin with that loss and turn out fine. I would not blame you. I want you to read this sentence twice. I would not blame you. I read the sentence twice. I kept reading. If you have decided not to stop, I want to tell you why I think you are the one who could do this. It is not because you are the only family I have left. That part is incidental. It is because of the summers, Hadley. Do you remember the summers? You were 7, 8, 9. You would come up from Madison for 2 weeks in July, and your father would drop you off and drive away, and you and I would sit on the porch in the evenings, and I would tell you stories. Stories about the farm, stories about the dairy operation, stories about your grandmother, stories about the people who had lived in this country before us. You listened to all of them. You listened to the ones that were dull. You listened to the ones that did not have endings. You listened to the ones that I was only telling to find out what they sounded like out loud. You were the only person in 50 years who ever sat on that porch and listened the way you listened. And I want you to understand, Hadley, that I built everything I built in that barn for someone who could listen. Listening is the whole thing. You listened. That is all it ever takes. The work is yours now. Finish it well, or don't finish it. Either is a choice I will respect, and either is a choice I made room for. Just know that it was always going to be yours. I knew this the summer you were 9 on the porch when you asked me what the word veteran meant, and I tried to answer you and could not, and you held my hand for a few minutes without saying anything. And
And then you said, "Okay, Grandpa, you can tell me later." I never told you later. I am telling you now. I love you. Grandpa. I read it 3 times. I folded it carefully. I put it back in the envelope. I sat at the kitchen table in Otis Brennan's house, and I held the envelope in my hands, and I cried finally, the way I had not cried at the funeral, the way I had not cried in the bank, the way I had not cried in the cellar. Otis came back in after a while. He did not say anything. He sat down across from me, and he drank his coffee, and we sat there together in the kitchen for a long time, and the sun moved across the floor. After a while, he said, "There is a reporter in Milwaukee." I looked up. His name is Gerald Holt. He works for the Journal-Sentinel. He is 61 years old. He has been writing investigative pieces for that paper for 34 years. I waited. His father, Otis said quietly, was the man who took his own life in 1981. Gerald was 9 years old when it happened. He has spent his entire career writing about things that other people did not want written about. He paused. He does not know what his father saw. He has never known. The family was told it was depression. The family was told it was alcohol. The family was told a lot of things that did not feel right. He has been a journalist for 34 years. Hadley and I think a part of him has been waiting for this story without knowing he was waiting. He set down his coffee. Your grandfather and I talked about him many times. Silas knew he existed. Silas would have gone to him eventually. He just ran out of time. I called Gerald Holt that afternoon from the kitchen phone. I told him my name. I told him my grandfather's name. I told him that I had documents related to an incident in Nevada in June of 1968 that he might be interested in seeing. I told him that the documents had to do with his father. There was a long silence on the line. When he spoke, his voice was very careful. The voice of a man who has spent 34 years not letting himself want anything too obviously. How soon can you bring them to Milwaukee? 2 days, I said. Bring everything. I will. He gave me an address. I wrote it down in the green notebook. I drove to Milwaukee on a Friday in late February. The roads had been cleared the night before, and the sun was out, and the truck behaved itself the whole way down. I drove with the banker's box on the passenger seat, and a smaller box of selected documents from the barn on the floor, and I did not turn on the radio because I wanted to be alone with the road. Gerald Holt's office was on the 4th floor of the Journal-Sentinel building. He met me at the elevator. He was tall and thin and gray, and he was wearing a button-down shirt that he had not tucked in fully, and his glasses were pushed up onto his forehead. He shook my hand the way people shake hands with witnesses, carefully, aware that the handshake mattered more than they could afford to show. He led me to a small conference room. I set the boxes on the table. He sat down across from me. "Tell me," he said, "from the beginning. Tell me what you have." I told him.
I had practiced this on the drive down. I had told myself the story out loud in the cab of the truck for 4 hours. By the time I sat down across from Gerald Holt in that conference room, I knew exactly which document to put down first, and which one to put down second, and which one to put down last. I started with the photograph. The 5 young men in fatigues. Camp Bishop, Nevada, June 1968. I pointed to my grandfather, second from the left. I pointed to Otis Brennan, far right.
I pointed to the third man in the photograph, the one in the middle, smaller than the others, with dark hair and a quiet face.
That is your father, I said.
Gerald Holt looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not pick it up. He did not touch it. He looked at it, and then he closed his eyes for maybe 10 seconds, and then he opened them, and he looked at me with a focused calm that I would come to recognize over the next 6 weeks as the look of a man who has been given the missing piece of a thing he had stopped expecting to ever solve. All right, he said, show me the rest. I showed him the rest. It took 4 hours. By the time I left his office that evening, he had a list of names to verify a set of photocopies he could take to his editor that night, and an understanding quiet but unmistakable that this was going to be the largest piece he had ever written, and that he was going to spend the next 6 weeks of his life on nothing else. We agreed I would come back the following Friday with the rest of the FOIA correspondence. I drove home in the dark. The next 6 weeks moved in a way I had never experienced. Gerald Holt and his research team verified everything. 2 researchers were assigned to him full-time. They cross-referenced my grandfather's documents against Army records, against the National Personnel Records Center, against newspaper archives in 3 states, against death certificates and probate records, and the dissolved corporate filings of the Las Vegas construction firm. They located 5 of the 11 families that my grandfather had been sending money to, and they conducted interviews. They found the survivors of the 17 civilian contractors. They found 3 retired Army officers who had been at Camp Bishop in 1968, and who after 53 years of silence were willing to speak on the record. He did not come up the gravel lane in his black Lincoln this time. He came up the lane in a rented sedan alone, without a driver. He parked at the bottom of the porch steps. He sat in the car for a long moment before he got out. He was different. He had aged in 6 weeks, in a way that did not make sense for 6 weeks. His coat was the same coat, but it sat on him differently. His shoulders, which had been straight on his first visit, were not straight now. He was carrying the weight of something that had begun to be too heavy. He knocked. I let him in. He did not sit down this time. He stood in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hand, and he looked at the wood stove. They are going to print it, he said. I waited. Wendell told me. There is going to be a story in the paper. There are going to be hearings. There is going to be a federal investigation. I did not say anything. He looked at me. Hadley, I want you to understand something about me. I did not do what your grandfather did. I did not have his courage. When I was 16 years old, I left this farm because I could not bear to be in the same house with the things he was carrying. I had heard pieces. I had not heard everything, but I had heard enough to know that what had happened to my brother in 1968 was not a thing I had the strength to be near. So I left. I went to Chicago. I built a life. I told myself that the work was his to do and that my staying away was a kind of help. I told myself that for 46 years. He paused.
6 years ago, a man named Wendell Crane reached out to me. He had been managing my brother's loans at the agricultural bank. He told me in a careful way that he believed my brother was engaged in activities that could embarrass the family. He told me that if certain things were ever made public, the consequences for me professionally and financially would be substantial. He asked me in exchange for certain considerations to help him monitor the situation, to let him know if my brother ever indicated in our correspondence or in our visits that he was planning to take any of his materials to a journalist or to an attorney. He looked at the floor. There were no visits, Hadley. There were no correspondences. I had not spoken to my brother in 40 years. But I took the considerations. I took them every year. I let Wendell Crane believe that I was useful to him. I let myself believe that I was harming no one. He looked up. When my brother died, Wendell came to me and said the time had come. He said you would be alone. He said you would be inexperienced. He said the situation could be handled cleanly if I was willing to make an offer. He said he had already arranged the pressure from the bank. He said all I had to do was come out here and make it easy for you to say yes. He stopped. I am here to tell you that I am not going to do that anymore. I am here to tell you that I will testify to the journalist, to the federal investigators, to anyone who asks. I will tell them what I have done and what I have taken and what I have known. I will lose a great deal. I am 64 years old, and I will lose almost everything I have built. I am telling you this because I have understood in the last 6 weeks that I have already lost the only thing that ever mattered. And it is too late to get it back. The brother I might have had, the man he became without me. He stopped talking. He looked at me. He was not asking for forgiveness. I could see that. He had not come to be forgiven. He had come because there was nothing else left to do, and because Otis Brennan had probably driven down to his hotel in Eau Claire and sat across from him in a coffee shop the day before and told him gently and without judgment what was about to happen. I did not forgive him. I did not tell him to leave. I told him that I was sorry he had not known my grandfather better, because he had been a good man, because he had loved the people who loved him,
And because I thought even now, even at the end of everything, that he would have been glad to know that his brother had come back before it was over to stand on the right side. Royce Wexford nodded. He went out to his rented sedan. He drove away. The story ran on a Sunday in early June. The headline was on the front page above the fold. Buried in the Desert. The Camp Bishop Exercise and the 50-Year Silence. Gerald Holt was the byline. The story ran 9 pages inside the paper. It included the names of the 5 civilian men who had died in 1968. It included photographs of 3 of them recovered from family albums by Gerald's research team. It included the name of Lieutenant Colonel Thaddeus Crane and the chain of command above him and the chain of consequences below him. It included my grandfather's name, Silas Wexford, the man who had spent 50 years building the case, the man who had sent $180,000 to 11 families that he had located one at a time over half a century, the man who had died in a kitchen in Wisconsin 3 months before the work was finished. It also named Otis Brennan, who had been the 2nd survivor of the exercise still alive when the story ran. And it named me. I had not asked Gerald Holt to keep my name out of it. He had asked. I had said no. I had told him that if my grandfather's name was going to be on it, then mine was too. Because the work had been passed to me, and I had carried it. And that mattered. The story landed the way Gerald had told me it would land. The Department of Defense issued a statement within 24 hours. 3 days after that, 2 committees in Congress announced hearings. A week after that, a federal task force was named to investigate the chain of command and the surviving officers connected to the exercise. Thaddeus Crane was 94 years old. He was placed under house arrest pending a hearing. He had been in declining health for some time, and his doctors stated that he was not competent to stand trial. He died in August in his bed in a private home in Lake Forest, Illinois. He did not face the people whose fathers and brothers and husbands he had killed. Wendell Crane was indicted in July. The charges were extortion, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The bank suspended him pending the outcome of the investigation. He resigned in August. He was convicted the following spring. He served 4 years. Royce Wexford testified. He testified to everything. He lost his job. He lost a substantial portion of his savings to legal fees and to a civil settlement reached with the families of the 11 men. He moved to a small apartment in Evanston. He sent me a Christmas card that December. I did not respond. I have not seen him since. The note from the bank was restructured. Not by Wendell Crane. He was gone by then. By a new officer at Harlan County Agricultural Lending, a woman in her 40s named Patricia Marsh, who came up the gravel lane in late June with a folder and a face that I learned over the following hour was the face of a person who had been hired specifically to clean up what her predecessor had done. The bank, she told me, had reviewed the loan file. The bank had identified a number of irregularities in how the loan had been administered over the previous 6 years. The bank, she said, was prepared to offer a substantial restructuring of the note at terms that would be sustainable for a farm of this size in light of those irregularities. I asked her who specifically had reviewed the file. She smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen from a banker in 5 months. "The federal investigators," she said. "Once they were finished with Mr. Crane, they had a few suggestions for us." The Camp Bishop Survivors Memorial Fund was established in September. It was set up by a coalition of veterans organizations and civilian families. The fund's stated purpose was to provide ongoing support to the descendants of the 11 civilian contractors who had died as a result of the 1968 exercise, and to other families affected by similar incidents that had since come to light in the wake of Gerald Holt's reporting. A representative of the fund came to the farm in October. He brought a check for $46,000. It was made out to me. He told me in a kitchen that was warm now and smelled like coffee that the fund's board had voted unanimously. He told me that the amount represented the outstanding balance on the agricultural note, plus a contribution toward the cost of the roof repair, which had been mentioned in passing in Gerald Holt's article. He told me that the board had felt strongly that the granddaughter who had carried the work to completion should not have to lose the land in order to do it. I cried for the second time that year. The man stayed for coffee. His name was Daniel Park. He had been the son of one of the construction workers who had died in 1968. He was 74 years old. He had not known what had killed his father in real terms until the morning the story ran in Milwaukee. He sat at my grandfather's kitchen table, and he asked me quietly if I would tell him about Silas Wexford. I told him about the summers on the porch. I told him about the way my grandfather had taught me to crack an egg with one hand. I told him about the way he had labeled every jar in the root cellar. We sat at the table for 2 hours. I paid off the note the following week. In late October, I named the chickens. I had been putting it off all year. My grandfather had not named chickens on principle, and I had honored that principle through the spring and the summer. But in October, I sat in the coop one afternoon with the 11 hens around me, and I understood, finally, what the principle had been about. He had not named them because he did not want to name 11 small living things after the 11 men he could not save. I named them anyway. I named them after the 11 men. I wrote the names down in the green notebook next to a sketch of the coop with a small note explaining which hen was which. I did not tell anyone the names. Not Otis, not Marjorie, not Gerald Holt, who had become a friend over the course of the year, and who came up to Creek Bend every few months for dinner. The names were just mine. A small thing my grandfather would have understood. I did not go back to Cornell. I enrolled in a distance program through a state university in November. Military history. I took 2 classes that first semester. I took 3 the next. I had not chosen the field because I wanted to study what had happened to my grandfather. I had chosen it because I had finally understood, after a year of carrying the work, that the kind of attention required to do what he had done was a kind of attention you learned by paying attention to other things first, to records,
to dates,
to the way one document confirms another, to the quiet patience of a search that takes 50 years. I bought a roll of barbed wire in November to fix the south fence. I bought new shelving in December for the root cellar. I bought a used compact tractor in March with money I had earned at the farmer's market over the summer, selling preserves from the jars in the cellar that my grandmother had taught my grandfather to make in the 1980s. The list never got shorter. I started a new notebook in January, a green one, the same as the first. I keep them in a row on the kitchen shelf above the table where I do the books. Otis still comes over every Thursday morning for coffee. He is 80 now. He moves more slowly, but he is still here, and he still tells me stories about my grandfather that I have not heard before, and he still listens when I have things to tell him the way my grandfather listened to me when I was small. Marjorie Doyle died last spring. She was 84. She left me her library, which was significant, and a note that said she expected me to read it. I am working on it. I am working on all of it. On a Tuesday in October, 2 years after I first walked into Wendell Crane's office, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh notebook and a cup of coffee, and I wrote a letter to a family in northern Arizona that the federal investigation had identified. A 12th family, one that my grandfather had not been able to find. The husband had died in the same exercise, but he had used a different name, and the records had been altered, and the family had moved 3 times in the ensuing decades. The investigators had found them, but the investigators were finished now. The hearings were over. The settlements had been paid. The story was no longer a story. The widow was 91 years old. She had a granddaughter. The granddaughter was my age. I wrote them a letter. I told them who I was. I told them about my grandfather. I told them what I knew. I told them that there was a small amount of money from the fund that was still earmarked for any family identified after the formal proceedings had closed. I told them I would help them if they wanted help navigate the process of filing. I sealed the envelope. I put a stamp on it. I walked it down the gravel lane to the mailbox. The sky was that particular October blue, the kind that you only get a few days a year in Wisconsin when the air is finally cold enough to be honest about itself, and the sun is still warm enough to mean something. I stood at the mailbox for a moment after I put the letter in. I raised the red flag for the carrier. I walked back up the lane. The hens were in the yard, all 11 of them. They scattered as I came up because they always scattered because they were chickens, and that was what they did. And I went up the porch steps and into the house where the wood stove was running quietly, and the kettle was about to boil, and the green notebook lay open on the table where I had left it. On the kitchen counter, in a small clay dish, was the brasserie from the north barn. I had not thrown it away. I had kept it. The barn was empty now. The files were in 3 separate archives, 2 in Washington and 1 at the State Historical Society in Madison. The corkboard was bare. The desk lamp was dark. The dirt floor was the same packed dirt floor But no one stood at the workbench any longer. I had not been able to make myself give up the key. Some inheritances are land, some are debts. The best ones are the unfinished work passed from one quiet pair of hands to another on a Tuesday morning in February in a kitchen in Wisconsin, with the snow coming down and the coffee going cold, and the long, slow, patient labor of someone who listened. I had listened. That was all it had ever taken.